Thanks, Concorn. I'd just maybe like to make a few brief points. I'd maybe recognise that it's a very good thing that the committee have discussed this issue, and I'm glad to participate in it. I'd echo the points made by Deputy Wallace in relation to former Minister Shatter. It's an open secret that previously Ministers for Justice such as Michael McDowell and Dermot Ahern didn't give a fiddler's for anybody who was inside our prison system. Probably they never met any of them, they didn't mix in their circles, and they didn't really care what went on behind the prison walls and took no interest in that topic. I do know that Minister Shatter, from the time he got into that position, took a very active interest in that area and was recognised throughout the prison service for that. And some of the measures that are, at least they're on paper or in law but not enacted, are attributable to that work, and that is definitely a good thing. I'd like to recognise as well the work done by the likes of the Penal Reform Trust, but particularly organisations like the Jesuits, who've really pushed the boundaries on these issues, because there's nothing in the report that I don't agree with. But at the same time, I think it's probably not hugely radical when you think about it. I mean, it's now accepted in society that people shouldn't be put in prison for non-payment of fines. The idea of open prisons is more to be welcomed. Overcrowding in prisons, the fact that people who are in our prisons come from certain, in the main, impoverished backgrounds and so on, play a huge bearing in that. But that's all very well, and we're kind of inching towards that. But to me, it's not really enough. And what we're doing isn't really in sequence with what we're saying either, which happens too often here. Because it's good that the old conditions in Cork are being addressed and there's new prison, but it's a regressive step that has a built-in more than single cell occupancy. Best practice says it should be single cell occupancy. Therefore, we shouldn't have approved a plan that provided for more than that. And it is absolutely the case that conditions in relation to women in prison have receded, and the numbers in the Docus Centre at the moment, quite frankly, are shocking. Now, I spent a month in the Docus Centre about 12 years ago. That was the time not long after it had opened. It was built on an ethos of being more enlightened, of rehabilitation, of training. Women were able to access studies and so on. But even by the time I got there, many of those amenities were underutilised. The educational provisions that were there weren't accessible to the women. And you had a total and utter revolving door scenario of generally young women from a similar background coming in, coming out, and overwhelmingly linked to them themselves being the victims of abuse, the victims of drug use. And really, they'd come into prison quite in not a good condition. Nice security and a couple of meals a day would sort of result in them actually improving health-wise. But then after their short term, they'd be put right back out into the conditions that they came from. A complete and utter total waste of money from start to finish. Now, I am actually a prison abolitionist. I don't believe that there is any legitimate basis at all for prison in society, except the very rare circumstances where somebody presents as a security danger to themselves or others. Other than that, very small number of people, and our focus on prison starts with those people. They should in some ways be the last people that we deal with in this regard. And I think too often we see prisons as being, well, they were always there. Well, do you know what? They weren't always there. Traditionally, prisons came onto the scene as just being holding centres until the real punishment was decided upon. And obviously, years ago, you had hangings and shootings and, dividing people up in four and burning their insides or whatever that they used to do. And prisons were put forward as a way of which being a more enlightened way of dealing with people. It came around the time of the abolition of the death sentence and the death penalty and all of that, that instead you have an area where you would keep people. But the purpose wasn't just about keeping them so that it wouldn't be endangering other people. It was supposed to be an opportunity for rehabilitation and for returning that person into being a more effective member of society and so on. And we've moved away from that. And there's been huge studies done which show that the closing down of institutions in relation to where people used to be put for mental health issues, that some of those people are being put into the prisons instead. And dealing with mental health issues has a direct correlation in terms of our prison numbers, no question or doubt about that. Now, just briefly on the question of women in prison. Until about the 1970s, 1980s, you could count on one hand the number of women who were in prison in Ireland, and they were usually just a couple of Republican women who were put in Limerick, and there wasn't anything else. And women didn't go to prison as a policy. Now, that's not because people are soft on women or not in favour of equal rights or anything like that. It reflects the crimes, if you like, that women are incarcerated for now. And if you evaluate what women go to prison for and what men go to prison for, they're completely different. And generally speaking, crimes such as shoplifting, low-level, non-violent crime linked to poverty and drug use are in the main what women are in prison for. And studies have been done by not hugely radical people, but people like Baroness Corston in the UK has done a tremendous report saying categorically the dislocation factor of putting women in prison because they're the primary carers of their children. It often results in those children having to move area, being homeless, becoming a drain on social services, being a drain on the broader family, that this is really, really regressive stuff, and I think we should be very much moving away from that. But the reality is that we aren't. There's actually more people, more women in prison now than there ever were before. And we need to address that situation. It doesn't do anybody any good. There are people in prison generally linked to immigration issues. We're aware of a woman who's in the Doka Centre at the moment who was a victim of trafficking into this country, trafficked in for exploitative labour, and she's been in there for about a year and a half. This type of stuff is absolutely lunacy. So I think we need to step back and say, everybody breaks the law. Maybe not everybody admits it, and maybe some people break more serious laws than other people do, but everybody does at one time or another. And we can't be demonising people for their behaviour. In actual fact, the schools now teach you that you shouldn't be saying children are bold or good. The behaviour can be bad or good, but the person themselves should be valued and worked with. And we do need to move in that direction. A huge amount of people in our prisons are there linked to drugs. We have to look at our drugs policy. The criminalisation of drugs that are used by whole sections of society on a regular basis, that's just ridiculous. And it ends up putting people in prison who shouldn't be there, who aren't a danger to anybody else. The laws that the Minister is proposing on criminalising the purchase of sex, again, ridiculous as far as I'm concerned, could lead to an increase in people being in prison who don't need to be so. And again, I think the points made about fines were done very well by Deputy O'Dowd. There are vested interests who want to keep our prison service going. There's a huge money-making industry, even in our public prison service. There are people who depend upon it for their livelihoods and so on, but we need to take a step back and look different. And restorative justice, getting people to sort of see their crime or what they did, paying back, not by locking them behind a door, but by confronting what they did and their behaviour, and in a sense paying back through community service, or that is a far better way of doing it. So look, I welcome the report. I think it's very good that we are discussing it. I think more work has probably been done in this stall on this issue than certainly over the last 10 or 15 years, but it's not enough, and we need to be a bit more radical in our approach. We should be striving for a situation where there are no prisons and some containment areas for a few people who need to be worked with because they're a danger to themselves and others, but other than that, it shouldn't be the form of punishment. I don't agree that punishment ever works. We should be about rehabilitating people and working on people's behaviour so that they can be fulsome members of society. If we spent a fraction of what we spend on prisons in education and investment in the impoverished areas from which most people end up in prison, everybody would be far better off.